Hey folks, Jeff with Centennial Woods here, and today we have a project that I'm excited to share because the way that we'll be going about this build, you can choose whether you wind up creating 2 exposed ceiling beams, 2 floating mantles, or one of each. And if you already have a Centennial Woods accent feature, this would be a great way to echo the look elsewhere in the space. Difficulty-wise, I think this would be considered a beginner to medium level project and is something you could likely tackle in a couple of days or less. There is a link to some free plans for this project that can be found in the description below, but here's a quick overview of the tools that I used, the materials, hardware, and adhesives, as well as a list of cuts that I made ahead of time before getting started. After ripping the plywood to width and cutting 2x8 boards down to 8-foot lengths, I've marked the locations where my center supports are going to go. I pre-drilled and countersunk the pilot holes before gluing and screwing the center supports to that 8-foot long 2x8. It's at this step in the process when you'll dictate whether your project becomes a mantelpiece or an exposed beam. If you want a mantle, you need to be sure and locate 2 of those center supports at the very end of the 2x8. That's because we're going to end up wrapping that center support. But an exposed beam will wind up being flush with a vertical wall and potentially connected to another beam, so we don't need to secure those center supports flush at each end. However, we do need to give ourselves some room to secure the screws into the ceiling and enough material to connect with another beam if the total length of that beam winds up being more than 8 feet. Next, I dry fit the plywood, then proceed to glue up and brad nail the 3 pieces together. You'll notice I start out by using the center support piece to ensure that my plywood joints stay square and tight during this glue up, and I clamp them together using that center support piece as well. Then once I start brad nailing it together, I make sure to shim this plywood box up, and this way I avoid accidentally nailing it to the center support piece too early or getting it stuck if there happen to be any glue squeeze out. Once we have both the center support piece and our plywood box put together, we're ready to move on to paneling. Since we're looking to create as much of a seamless look as possible, we'll need to miter cut our paneling along the length of the planks. Not all planks are going to wind up needing to be mitered, but I figured that I was probably going to be picky about which tones went where on this piece, so I went ahead and started by mitering all of them on the table saw with my blade set at a 45-degree angle. Now it's time to start paneling, and once again, I'd like to avoid nailing my plywood box to that centerpiece before mounting it, so I remove it for now and use a couple extra 2x8 pieces to retain the shape of the box while installing the planks. Here comes another one of those details that's going to determine whether you wind up with a mantle or an exposed beam. If you're looking to create a mantle, you'll need to make sure that the first and last paneling planks are mitered at a 45-degree angle on one end as well as the edge. From there, we can install that first row with the mitered edge facing out. Moving forward, the rest of the assembly steps will be the same regardless of whether you're working on a mantle or an exposed beam until we get to the mounting process. Before moving on to that row that'll be closest to the wall or the ceiling, we'll need to go back to the table saw and remove the mitered edges on the pieces we've selected and rip it to fit the remaining width of that exposed plywood. Hypothetically, I suppose you could have started out by ripping that mitered edge and the remaining width all at once, but I think this way gives yourself a little bit of extra room to be selective with the tones and how they're arranged. So I think trading off a little bit of work for the ability to be as picky as you want is, in the end, worth it. Once we've got both rows installed, we can flip it and start working on the other side. You'll notice that I started by installing the 2 outside faces of the plywood box. That's because while our paneling material is milled to a 1/4 inch consistent thickness and 5-inch width, reclaimed wood is variable by nature, so I knew I was going to wind up having to play just a little bit of jazz in order to fit the material onto the center face of that plywood box. So installing the 2 sides first would ultimately give me the most amount of control when applying to the face, and as a result, we'd get the tightest fit between board seams throughout the entire piece. After ripping the center planks to width, I lined up the mitered edges and continued to install. Once again, just want to reiterate that if you're going with a mantle, you want to make sure to miter the first and last end of the center planks as well as the edges. Again, because we'll be wrapping the ends of that center mounting piece at the very last step in this process, and it's part of what gives the appearance that you've mounted a solid single beam. Once the entire plywood box was covered in our paneling, it was time to begin the mounting process. Here's a quick look at the space before the decorations were taken down and we removed all the stuff where the beam would be going. Once I located the studs, it was time to pre-drill and countersink the piece. One thing I found particularly helpful during the prep phase was to enlist 2 of these 4-legged supervisors to sit around and do absolutely nothing in terms of helping me out. It was at this moment I realized I only had 2 hands. And while a patient man would have waited for somebody to come help, and a smart man would have figured out a way to balance the beam, I am neither patient nor smart. Luckily, I'm stubborn. So, through sheer force of will and absolutely zero help from my 4-legged supervisors, I was able to get the wall pre-drilled while keeping the center mounting piece level and ultimately securing it with the 3.5-inch screws. That said, if you do have someone willing to lend a hand or can figure out a better way to get it on the wall than I did, I would recommend doing it. This is just the way I went about it, but it definitely could have been easier. And here you can see why, if your goal is to wind up with a mantel, we installed those 2 center support 2x8 pieces on each end. This way, we don't have to sacrifice plywood just to close off the box. But again, if you're looking to create an exposed beam, you don't need to do this. Once everything was finally on the wall, using a screwdriver, I applied pressure and rolled it along the edge of the corner seams. This technique just helps to merge the wood fibers and close up any small gaps that may have been present along the mitered edges and ends. At last, the project was complete, and here's a look at the space after everything was put back. Ashley at She's the Carpenter did an exposed ceiling beam project like this and wound up with multiple beams that are very similar looking to ours. So go ahead and check out that project to get a better feel for the look. And if you haven't checked out her other content already, you should definitely do that. All right, that's all I've got for this time around. And if you'd like to help out by following us or interacting with this video, we'd greatly appreciate it. Thanks.